Hello, and you are very welcome to Cut Through the Noise with me, Aisling O'Rourke, the communications coach. Cut Through the Noise is the podcast that helps business leaders increase sales through communications and marketing that elevates your brand. And this is series 5 of the podcast. So if it's your first time listening, please do make sure to go back and check out our back catalogue. In this series, we're focusing in entirely on podcasting for business. It feels like everyone has a podcast these days, but how can you as a business leader harness the power of podcasting as part of your marketing strategy? Well, to discuss this, I'm delighted today to be joined by Claire Darmody of Prestige Media. Claire works with clients to produce stellar podcasts based on her over 2 decades of experience in broadcasting. Claire, you are very welcome to Cut Through the Noise.
Thanks, Amelia, for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Claire, first things first, tell me about Prestige Media.
And as you mentioned there, everyone wants a podcast, and Prestige Media are only too delighted that people want podcasts. So as you also mentioned, I have 2 decades experience as a broadcast producer. So I've worked on live radio and television for over 20 years, and I currently work as a senior producer on the Pat Kenny Show on News Talk, which I love. But a couple of years ago, I started Prestige Media, and in Prestige we produce podcasts. Well, we help everything from the start of a concept right up to producing the full podcast series, and we also facilitate media training and communications coaching. And how it got started really was because, like with all the experience I have, people would have been asking me different questions about different media things, and basically for different consultations, I guess. And I was just doing that for friends and people I knew in the industry. And lots of people would have suggested that I went into business doing it myself. And actually, Anna Geary, a very good friend of mine, was the one who really pushed it. I'd helped her with the project. And she said, you should just be doing this as a business. What I do does include some consultation on other projects for people, but the podcasting is the main thing I do, as you said.
Now, as we said, Claire, it does at the moment feel like everybody's got a podcast, and therefore every business needs a podcast. And because of the business you and I are both in, obviously, we're only delighted to help people with that. But creating a great podcast, that takes a lot of work. So what in your experience makes a great podcast?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Actually, a potential client got in touch recently, and I know her, and she sent a message saying, I'm thinking of doing a podcast. I know, as if to say, don't come at me. I'm like, well, I don't mind, but I understand. But that's what you're right. Like, people think, oh, everyone has a podcast. But actually the market in Ireland is much smaller than other countries. So we're way behind compared to England and America. So there's way more room, and people think the market's saturated. But actually, if you listen to a podcast and you like the type of content, you listen to other podcasts that have similar content. So we're nowhere near a saturation, but I understand that people might be a bit fatigued by the thought of it, or they don't fully understand the industry and how it works.
Yeah.
What makes good podcast is what makes good radio show, and what makes good business podcast is what makes a good any podcast, to me anyway. So it's really important that you get the content right and that the content is good. And that means that it's important to the listener, and for a business podcast, it lines up with your brand and what you're doing. But also that it sounds good, that the quality is good, because we've all heard those podcasts that sound like they were done in someone's toilet, and it's just such a hard listen. And you could put the best talent into a room, and if it doesn't sound good, it's a switch off. So content is really important, both the content as in making sure it's interesting, but also that it's in line with your business. And as I said, it's well produced and sounds good. And then the performances, because the host and the guests are really important to keep people interested. I've always said, and as you know from your years in radio, Aisling, you can ruin a perfectly good story with a bad performer, and a really good performer can tell a really crap story and make it interesting. And when you're dealing with businesses, sometimes they might have someone they fancy as a great host, and that might not be the best person. Now, so obviously we do media training, so we can make people who need to be hosting a podcast sound better. And some podcasts will go for well-known hosts for that exact reason. But who delivers the information and how they do it is important. I do think that's really key to any good podcast. And then
on that, and I'm going to pause you on that. That's a really valuable point, because I think sometimes in companies, the assumption is, well, that person's CEO or that's the chairperson. It has to be them because of the title that they hold, but they have to be able to hold the listener's attention. They have to be able to engage an audience. And if that person is not willing to learn how to do that, then perhaps there's somebody else in the team that could do a better job and is willing to learn, and perhaps has more time to learn how to do it well.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, business podcasts, if they really have someone that they want to put forward, it's not necessarily our job to tell them not to. Whereas trying to get that person up to speed, or maybe, as you said, have another person sharing the hosting duties. But you'll find that when people are really passionate about their business, and they know their stuff, it's easier to shape them to sounding better.
Mhm.
You know, like someone who's passionate about law or you know, finance can sound passionate and engaged and also get excited by the topic they're discussing. And maybe, you know, you bring a really dynamic guest in to help them. But yes, if someone is really not a great communicator, it would be remiss not to say, is there someone else that might feel more comfortable? In my experience, Aisling, people who are not great communicators don't feel comfortable behind a mic. They don't push themselves forward and they don't really want to do it. You rarely find someone who loves to sound their own voice who hasn't got a great voice, actually. But it is a different experience than when you're doing a lifestyle podcast where you might have someone really well known or who's already kind of a natural born presenter. Yeah.
So then, okay, we have to get someone who's a really good host or a really good presenter. We have to have something interesting to talk about. Tell us, though, about the role of a producer, because I think sometimes people feel that podcasting can be a lonely enterprise, that it's just you and a microphone. But in fact, you can have a team around you working on the podcast. You can get the support of a producer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of people, as you pointed out, people feel like, should I have a podcast? Why don't I have a podcast? And a producer like me would often help people recognize the why of why they're doing the podcast. And also then what it might look like and how the shape might take. So people might say, we really want a podcast because it's the space you want to move into. And I'm not going to talk them out of that, but I would want to know why they want to move into that space, what it might look like, what format it might take. And then we develop the concept with them. So, you know, the format might be like how long, how many guests, will it always be the same host? Are you going to go through a number of topics? Is there going to be an arc to the series? Like for you, this particular series is all about podcasting. Some companies will want a whole series about one part of their business, and then others will want to chop and change. So that's kind of a big part of what I do as a producer with podcasts, is come up with the concept with them. And that can be anything from helping them name it to getting the sig tune, but also at the very beginning, it is talking about the why and how it might sound. And if they want video, and do they really need video? And some people do really need video, and then other people don't need video. And with business podcasts, a lot of the time, maybe not every time or not for every episode. People also think that you need to record the whole thing. And while you do, no one's going to watch it. It's podcast, it's audio. But video clips can really help to market it and bring some spark to it. So yeah, I think the role of producer at the beginning is certainly to come up with the concept, streamline the vision of what the company want. And then after that, depending on how much of your services they really want, it can be anything from coming up with the guest ideas, booking the guests, liaising with the guests, prepping the guests, pre-interviewing them, questions. And then sometimes a lot of that work they want to do themselves, but they really need you to sit in the studio and live produce, as I call it, which is saying, no, you've rambled a little bit there, or just maybe bring that point back, or on the list, we were going to do this. We maybe are moving on in time. So keeping them with a bit of focus. Because as I said, people who love to talk about stuff they're passionate about are great, but it's about keeping a little bit of direction and a little bit of discipline so that it doesn't end up being an hour and a half with three people chatting about their chosen topic, but it's not going to be something that people will listen to. And again, once you figure out their why and you help them hone that in, and you know whether it's to attract new clients, whether it's to value added to existing clients, whether it's industry based, then it's easier to figure out exactly how it might sound. And, you know, because sometimes people can want to be everything to everybody. And that's hard to do when it comes to a business podcast. And people do them from all sorts of reasons. But yeah, I think the role of the producer can start a concept, and then a lot of the live producing, and then it can afterwards be post-production, like we would look after in Prestige. Anyway, we look after everything, like the post-production, the editing up on the platforms, iTunes, Spotify, all of that, the video captions, you know, everything, the show notes. So yeah, the role of producer in a production company is really to take your podcast from concept to where someone can download it or listen to it on Apple.
And you know, we have to be honest with people, all of that, it's actually quite a lot of work. It's not just the case of, okay, I've got my microphone, I've got a quiet room, let's just talk. There's quite a bit of time and effort that has to go into this if it's something that you want to embark on. But as you and I both know, it's a wonderful marketing tool. It's a great way of adding credibility to your brand. Why do you think it's so popular? It's become such a successful marketing tool.
Yeah, like I would say though, for anyone listening, if they're starting out and it's a sole trader or whatever, it is possible to do a podcast without a whole production company and a whole suite, which is lovely, and it makes it very accessible. And I love that. And sometimes people come to me and they just ask for consultation at the beginning. They just want a little bit of help how this might look. Now, they do often come back. And when it comes to businesses, people generally do want the professional. It's, they want to do it right from the beginning, but it is accessible to people. I would like to say that. What's making it so popular? I think, as you said, firstly, it's just a buzzword. Like, do we need a podcast? Why do we need a podcast? Should we have a podcast? But I think it is, I think, the podcast, like more and more people listen to podcasts now than ever did before. And I think depending on your why, and it's different for everybody, it does add value to your business. And sometimes it just merely raises the profile or the brand. So I would have produced a finance podcast that was a very much informative, how-to, consumer-led podcast, but it was paid for by a business. And it's Paul Merriman. I mean, everyone knows I would have produced Paul's podcast. And Paul has a whole brand on Instagram, but he has a business behind him. And he loves talking to people, and that's what his whole brand is about. But his brand is about his business. And obviously, loads who listen to the podcast would have understood who he was, what they did, come in and become new clients through the podcast. So it can be that simple. And then other times it's just about a bit of brand awareness. And as I said, sometimes it's industry to industry. Like, I work with another client, and the service he offers, he wants high-end clients. So we devised a podcast series that was going to really showcase what his business does. And he's not necessarily looking to be the number one listened to podcast in Ireland, but he is definitely going to be able to use this as a tool to convince high-end people in other industries that his is a service they'd like to use. So that's a completely different way businesses use a podcast. And that will work very well for him. And then the other thing, I suppose, sometimes is businesses decide to sponsor a podcast, that they outsource the podcast altogether, but they want their name to be aligned with it. So we know some of the big brands will have, they want to do a lot of corporate governance or corporate sustainability, ESG, basically anything where they look like they're doing the right thing. It can be that simple. But equally, like a finance company, insurance company, if something's in line with what they offer, they might want to sponsor a podcast. It's not necessarily the insurance podcast, but it is something in line with what their business does, or their, a financial company, whatever.
And on that, how does sponsorship of podcasts work? Like, I know you and I work in the area, but for people listening, if, say, you've got a podcast idea, but you need a little bit of help, maybe hiring a studio or to get the kit, you need that bit of sponsorship to get you started. How do people go about finding sponsors, or even approaching a sponsor?
Look, I'll be honest with you, like, it's very difficult to get a sponsor. Like, really, and I've worked with clients who've got sponsors for first time podcasts, but it's rare. And a lot of them would be lifestyle type podcasts. Really, when it's in the business world, they're paying for their own podcast because they want a podcast with their business. They're not going looking for someone else to fund it, but they might want to go off and fund another podcast. And that would be the lucky gift of the person who they wanted to sponsor it. But being realistic, if you want to make a podcast, and people are always asking me, how do you make money from podcasts? There is a way of making some money, maybe to cover costs for smaller podcasts. If you get a certain number of listens via Acast, and that's worth looking into for people who are doing smaller podcasts. But from a business point of view, yeah, it's hard to get sponsorship, and it would take a couple of seasons and some good listenership numbers for that to turn around for people. But you can go direct, you can go via agencies. It's possible. It is possible, and it is a growing market. And there is some great lifestyle podcasts out there in the areas of parenting and finance and all of those areas that we'd all be familiar with, that do get sponsorship and lucrative enough to keep them going. But it's not just anyone can start a sponsor or podcast and just go and get a massive sponsor to pay for it to be funded. I'm just being realistic. It's not easy. You'd need to be established with significant figures, and also the brands need to be aligned. So if your podcast is in a certain area, maybe the vitamin brands and the menopause brands want to partner with you, but like, not everyone's going to have that. And if people are a bit more edgy, maybe not so much. From a business point of view, as I said, they usually do pay for themselves, and they are happy to pay for the proper whole suite of, can you just do it for us and give us back the finished product? Because if you're going to make it, you want it to sound really good.
Absolutely. And if you want it to be aligned with your business, you want it to be at the same standard, professional standard that you would set for any other part of the business as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like I'm working with a client at the moment, an exciting new podcast actually, and they have done their own, and they have their own recording suite and everything. They're a big global company. They've offices all over the world. And they came to me because they wanted to get someone in to do it professionally for them, even though they have their own recording studio, and they've done stuff like webinars and smaller things, but they just needed to bring someone in. And we even talked about me sending them kind of the whole video, and they'd edit their own. Then they were like, we just go for the clips. It's just easier for them. And with companies like that, it's not not money's always an issue with everyone, but like it wasn't about the cost. It was about getting it done professionally and having it honed down to a very specific plan. And we recorded the first two recently, and they're great fun. And they actually, like, again, businessmen, businesswomen, not their normal job, but we're all great performers and really chatty, and excited to be there and excited to do it, and definitely showing a side of their business in a way that they wouldn't have been able to before. I've had other clients actually who do a lot of webinars that are now moving towards podcasting, which is interesting. Webinars are still very visual, but the concept behind them is still very podcastable. And I do believe, even from radio and how the Pat Kenny show is consumed now, I do think post-COVID, I mean, sorry, podcasting obviously was around way before COVID, but I do think post-COVID, people are consuming media at different times and in different ways. And that whole live aspect has changed. Like Pat Kenny podcasts do really, really, really well, like really, really well. And even though so does the live show do exceptionally well, great listens, huge show, like most listened to commercial radio show on the station in the country at the moment. But the podcast listens are still amazing.
Yeah.
There's people who listen to stuff like the Friday Forum or, the food slot, not during the time that we're on air, but afterwards. So I think that also transfers to people who consume webinars or want to have true crime podcasts or want to learn about, like, legal advice or financial advice. I think that it just how we consume our audio and our media has changed, and it is changing all the time. Be it that longer commutes, people are home more, people are exercising at different times. It's different and it's growing.
And I think one of the things that I love, and now look, I grew up in a radio household. I will always love radio, and I will always tell my clients that 81% of Irish adults listen to radio every single day. So, like, do not ignore radio if you're in business.
But I wonder if some of those 81% do now consume the likes of Pat Kenny Show or Claire Byrne or whoever via podcast.
And like, one of the things that I love about it is that you're making an active decision. Like I walk home, I turn on the radio, whatever's on is on. But if I go to Spotify, if I go to Apple Podcasts or, any other like Breaker or any other platforms before anybody gives out to me, there are lots of other platforms out there.
Yeah.
But if I go to them, I'm going to choose the podcast I'm in the mood for. So if it's early morning for me, it's business podcasts. It's, something that will help me be productive during the day. Later on into the evening, I listen to comedy podcasts. I absolutely adore comedy podcasts to help me fall asleep. So I love how...
And yet I know other people who love talk radio and just cannot stand listening to serious stuff first thing in the morning. And then they love your kind of breakfast show format. So they'd be listening to your comedy podcast maybe first thing.
Yes.
And then as they settle into the day, they're listening to the more serious stuff. So it does really depend on who you are as a person and your interests. And that's where I suppose business podcasts come in as well. Because like if you're a finance guy or you're a business person or you're a legal lady or whatever, and that's your stuff, that's going to be something that suits you and that you want to listen to. But equally, businesses might decide they want to, I'm not going to name any names now because I'll get in trouble with all my different clients, but they might decide they want to be aligned with a great female influencer who has a really interesting podcast that attracts a lot of women listeners. Or, like you can imagine, like female insurance company wants to sponsor a very female listen to podcast that's, sharing stuff that's important for women, and equally, like a financial institution might want to sponsor a business podcast. And like where alignments might come in, where a business wants to have a podcast but doesn't really need one about their own content, because what they do day to day won't necessarily get a lot of listens. But this huge influencer or this person with a high profile in this area or this industry will. So, an interior designer who has loads of followings or is great on architecture or whatever will do a podcast, and then a paint company sponsors it. So
statistically, and there have been studies done on podcasting and the credibility around podcasting, and even being a sponsor of a podcast and the benefit to companies for that. It's actually statistically quite high. So even from a memorability perspective, if you sponsor a podcast, the listeners are more likely to want to inquire about you and your business because they remember the name. They want to find out what it is that you do and maybe what it is that you sell or why you're connected to this particular podcast. But if we go back,
I should say that actually you're right. Sponsorship is something that I would say to people, it's not easy to get as an individual or a small business, but sponsorship is definitely a very popular way forward for brands. Like, listen, like I'd be shot if I didn't say advertising on radio is still extremely impactful. And we know that, and even having slots on radio shows is still extremely impactful. But sponsoring events and sponsoring podcasts and sponsoring live podcast events, it is a newer way. And you're right, the recognition the brand recognition is big, and like sure, a great one I always think is a great brand connection is Electric Ireland and Darkness into Light. So
Yeah.
if you can get a brand synergy like that, where like you're literally lighting up like a global charity event that people recognize so well. Everyone recognizes the charity and the brand now. And if you can get a synergy like that with a podcast, be it a live event or a series podcast, that is very powerful because you can think you switch off a bit when there's an ad on the telly or the radio, but listen to a podcast, you're kind of willing to let it be rolled over. And some of the podcasters now will actually describe, what they're doing with the product, or they'll give a special discount for the product. And that kind of stuff, it's fairly priceless of a brand recognition, and especially with the demographic of people who listen to podcasts. So you're right, sponsorship is definitely the way forward when it comes to like brand alignment and business podcasts, not necessarily having your own, but definitely being aligned with the right one.
So then if you're thinking of going into podcasting, if you think, do you know what, we've a really interesting business, we're doing great things, but we want to let more people know about what it is that we're doing. Like I recently worked with a local county council and their climate action team, and they were doing amazing work, but nobody in the area knew that, that's what they were doing because they weren't communicating it well. They are now, after a number of months' work, of course. But say, for example, if you need to elevate your marketing and that podcasting is a way you'd like to try doing that, what are your top tips for business people listening?
As in, if they've decided they want one, where to start?
Yeah.
I think, again, to say it again, but you need to come back to the why. So
Okay.
like if what you want is you want to tell people about what this great group that you're discussing, for example, are doing, then fantastic. But you've got to weigh up, how are you going to market that? How are you going to get people to listen? And are the listens what's important, or is just having a place on the website where people can go in and see what you do? And all those questions need to be asked. I think, firstly, why are you doing it? But it is beneficial for lots of businesses to look into podcasting. And then you have to ask, is it better to have our own based on what our business does? Are people going to listen? Is listenership the most important reason we're doing this? So a lot of podcast clients of mine who are businesses, it's not that they don't want the listeners, but that's not really the point. And I'd say to clients, like, you're not going to be the number one listened podcast in Ireland. Like, that's not really the sphere you're in, but it's a lot of the time it's adding value to their business. And that might be raising brand awareness, as I said earlier, value added to existing clients, getting new clients. For something like the county council having a project like that, it is really nice to have that. And you'll find that interested parties, and we know there's a huge amount of interested parties and organizations in that particular sphere now. And you know more about that area than I do, but there's lots of people that would be willing to share that podcast maybe on their website, to prove that other people are doing this great work. And also in a big organization where there's people working, like big numbers of people working, it's nice for the staff to see someone recording and documenting and acknowledging, this is what we do. Other people in the organization see it. Other county councils see it. This is what you do. You've been seen. And people can learn more about what you're doing. And it's just a different medium of sharing your work. As I said, like that would have been webinars before, or newsletters, and I don't know if people pay attention to those anymore, but they might listen to the podcast about what happens. So I think sometimes it's just about visibility for, your own organization. So where to start would be the why. And then after that, it's kind of, how do I think it's going to look like? So why are we doing it? And then what do we want to do? Do we want to do 3 episodes, 4 episodes, 10 episodes? Do you want to keep coming back? Do you want to do different sections of the business? And then how do we go about doing it? Which is, do we approach someone like me, or there's loads of production companies, there's loads of podcasting companies that you can go to, and they all have varying costs. Or is it something that we can do kind of in-house, or do we want to trial it first? So they're the kind of tips I'd say. But I think the most important thing is, why are you doing it? And that's not to put people off, but it's to give them a focus. Because you might end up deciding, I don't know why we're doing this. Maybe this money could be used better elsewhere, or maybe there's a different way of marketing what we're doing here. And if we are going to do it, how are we going to make it most worth our while? So focus and concept and what it's going to look like and why you're doing it is, I think you need to keep coming back to that.
Well, Claire Darmody of Prestige Media, thank you so much for joining us on Cut Through the Noise. How do people find you, Claire, if they'd like to find out more about Prestige or connect with you?
Thank you for that opportunity, Aisling. People can find me on prestigemedia.ie, and my number and my email address and all my contact details are there. And there's lots of lovely testimonials from my clients. And I do, as I said, also offer media training, communications coaching, but podcasting is most of my business. So people can find me there if they're interested.
Well, thanks again for talking to us. I hope people listening really enjoyed our conversation. I know I certainly did. Thank you for listening to Cut Through the Noise with me, Aisling O'Rourke. Don't forget to hit that follow button on your preferred podcast app to stay updated on all our episodes. We're now on YouTube as well. So if you'd like to sit down and watch the full episode over on YouTube, go to The Communications Coach and you'll find us there. But remember, while content may be king, clarity is key to making sure that you and your brand stand out from the crowd. If you need personalized advice on your communications and marketing strategy, don't hesitate to reach out on hello@thecommunicationscoach.ie. Have a great week, and we'll be back with another episode of Cut Through the Noise, same time next week.